First, Paul was a brilliant scholar who knew the Old Testament backwards and forwards. The 20th century atheist philosopher Antony Flew said that Paul obviously possessed a first-class philosophical mind. When the Roman governor Festus objected to Paul's claims, he couldn't say, "Paul, you're stupid." He could only say, "Paul, your great learning is driving you mad." Now, being a brilliant scholar doesn't make you right, but since Jesus claimed to fulfill Old Testament prophecy, knowing the contents of the Old Testament and being able to carefully evaluate those contents certainly helps. Second, Paul was a contemporary of Jesus who knew all of the relevant languages for examining Jesus' teachings. If you want reliable information about a person, it's pretty helpful to be a member of the person's own generation, to be in the same country, and to speak the original languages. So Paul was in the perfect position to learn as much as he wanted about Jesus.
But I really want to say, and in this book I try to say, Paul is one of the most important public intellectuals of all time. One of the tragedies of the way we do things in the Western world today is that if somebody wants to study Paul, they'll probably be sent to a department of religion. Wrong place. Paul belongs in the world of politics, of culture, of economics, of community life, as well as what we call religion and theology and philosophy. And we diminish Paul if we think of him simply as a quote-unquote religious figure. He is out there articulating a new vision of all reality. And he's not only articulating it verbally and in writing, he's articulating it through creating and forming and chivying and managing and wrestling with real communities who are experimenting with this remarkable new way of being human. And as a result, there are probably far more people today who wrestle with Paul than there are with the two great public intellectuals, as it were, either side of him, Cicero and Seneca, and others like him. These are great people, and Plutarch and Epictetus, and those great figures. But Paul, nevertheless, stands out. And he stands at one of the great transition points, the great sort of turning point in world history. And he stands there holding together the Jewish world, the Greek world with all its philosophy, the Roman world with all its politics and its new roads and so on, and he holds them in a new synthesis in a way that nobody had done before. Because though there were some books like the Wisdom of Solomon that were doing a bit of that, Paul, by being grasped by the gospel of Jesus, Israel's Messiah, crucified and risen, now the Lord of the world, Paul has a new vantage point from which he holds all these things together, so that he's absolutely insistent that what has happened and what he's doing is the fulfillment of Israel's purpose. This is where it was all going, even though we never saw it, rather like the two on the road to Emmaus. Oh, we had hoped that he would redeem Israel, but now did not our hearts burn within us as he expounded the scriptures? This is how it had to be. Paul has that in spades. So it's fulfilling Israel's aspirations, albeit in a shocking new way. And that gives Paul, as it were, the theological and scriptural energy which carries him into all the tasks that he does and to face all the sufferings that he does. But then Paul realizes that if Israel's God is the Lord of the world, and if Israel's God has revealed once for all the great truths about the way the world really is, this means we must, in his words, take every thought captive to obey the Messiah. So Paul can quite cheerfully outflank the Stoics, outflank the Epicureans, outflank the Academy, the Platonists. And sometimes he sounds a bit like a Stoic, sometimes he sounds a bit like a Platonist, and then the larger edifice reasserts itself, and we see that in his exposition of Jesus as the meaning of the whole creation, we find all these strands of truth, of philosophy, of human exploration and wisdom held together, rushing together. And then if it's Israel's traditions and the thought of the Greek world, it's also the Roman world with its extraordinary empire, which was just doing its thing in spades in the middle of the first century. And Paul comes along and talks about the good news that Jesus is Kyrios, Lord. And sometimes sometimes even that Jesus is soter, savior, another thing that some of the Caesars like to say about themselves. And Paul envisages, I was going to say, a new kind of empire. The word empire is very contested at the moment, and part of the point of what Paul is doing, just as you find in Jesus' teaching in, say, Mark chapter 10, is that empire has been stood on its head. Power itself has been stood on its head. There is a new power, a new sort of power let loose in the world. It's the power of suffering love, which is one of the reasons why Paul himself realizes that if he is to be the vessel and the instrument of that love, he himself will be called to suffer in all sorts of ways. So why a biography of Paul? Because somebody who could think all this and try to do all this is far more than just a brain box on legs or even a praying heart on legs. He's all of that, but he's a whole rounded personality, intersecting into engaging with whole rounded communities and trying to do something new. So Paul is vital as the early interpreter of Jesus. Jesus, the one who announced and more particularly inaugurated God's kingdom. Something new has happened. A victory has been won, as a result of which the world is a different place. It's hard for us to hear that because so much in the public world of today says, no, nothing actually changed. It just all went on. You just had some new religious ideas, and there were plenty of other new religious ideas. And Paul would have said, absolutely not. When Jesus rose again from the dead, something changed in the way the world is, which opens a door. The great rusty door of history has swung open, and a voice says, now, come into God's new world and see what it looks like. So when Paul is holding together Jewish Jesus believers and Gentile Jesus believers and insisting that they belong at the table together, this isn't just about having slightly better table manners. The fact that now Jew and Greek and slave and free and male and female belong at the same table is the sign, as far as he's concerned, that the powers that have ruled the world and have kept the world in its different compartments have been defeated. And if you don't believe that, he says to Peter at Antioch, you're denying the truth of the gospel. So, summing it all up, what was Paul trying to do? What was his aim? It would be easy to say, and 50 years ago I would have said, Paul was telling people about Jesus so that when they died they would go to heaven. And I really want to say, that's the wrong place to start. Now, as some of you know, if you read my book, Surprised by Hope, and other bits and pieces, the New Testament doesn't say that the name of the game is how to get to heaven when you die. If you go to the 1st century AD looking for somebody who talks about that, the primary person I would go to is Plutarch, who is a 1st century Middle Platonist, who has a whole treatise on how our souls are exiled from their true home in heaven, and we hope one day that they'll get back there. That's not what Paul says. Paul is looking forward to the day when God will renew heaven and earth and will raise his people from the dead to a new bodily life within that new integrated reality. Now, how this plays out is full of all sorts of other questions. But I want then to say, so what was Paul doing? Well, he was founding and maintaining communities. And I have a riff which I've been developing out of this book and so on. What sort of communities? Well, they're worship-based, educational, egalitarian, philanthropic, fictive kinship groups. I'll say it again. They're worship-based, educational, egalitarian, philanthropic, fictive kinship groups. Our shorthand for that is churches. But if we say churches, then that will conjure up various images in our minds from which at least one or two of those words will probably be missing. Worship-based because they exist in order to invoke Jesus as Lord, to celebrate his presence and his healing power and his reconciling work in them and through them into the world, because they're also educational. What were people teaching in Paul's churches? One of the things I think they were teaching was how to read. A lot of people were functionally illiterate in the ancient world, but Paul wanted them to be able to search the scriptures for themselves. That's part of Christian maturity. So the church was in the vanguard of teaching teaching people to read and to read Scripture particularly. And they were egalitarian, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We struggle still to implement that. For Paul, that was an extraordinary, unheard of experiment, a very dangerous one. People would look on and see all these people, very different people, all going into a house on a Sunday morning. Who are they? What are they doing? And they talk about family and so on. And they are philanthropic. Paul says, while we have time, do good to all people, and especially to those of the household of faith. The churches were doing what the Jewish communities had done, that is to say, looking after people in their own community who needed help, who needed money, who needed healing, medicine, and whatever. But now they were doing it as far as they could for this is one of the main reasons why Christianity spread. Nobody had ever tried this experiment. Let's have egalitarian philanthropic communities who, even if they're not doing all the stuff on the street, worshipping the idols, going on the processions, etc., even if they're not doing any of that, so people think this is bad news, they'll get us into trouble, maybe there'll be an earthquake or a lightning strike or something, we'll know who to blame. No, these are people who people regard as good neighbors. Paul says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. The people on your street who are having a party, you go and be the life and soul of that party. The people who are having a funeral, you go and genuinely share their sorrow. These are people who other people will enjoy having them around. And there'll be a reason for that, because they are reflecting the generous love of Jesus into that community. And they are living as, in the anthropologist term, fictive kinship groups. That is to say, living as family, even though it's blindingly obvious that they're not. And the ancient world, family means the people who are down the street from you who will help you out. One of the nicest moments I had when I was Bishop of Durham was one night I was doing a confirmation in a very much below the tracks parish in Gateshead, and the vicar asked one of the confirmation candidates, a woman in her 30s, he said, what's it like since you've been coming to this church? And she blurted it out. She said, it's like having a great big second family. And then she turned to me and said, was I supposed to say that? And I said, yes, that means this is a real church. She lived in a community where family meant precisely the people round the corner who would look out for you when bad things were happening, or would celebrate with you when good. And she had found the church to be that sort of community. Thank God that it never gets into the press, of course, but there are many, many communities like that who are doing precisely what Paul said they should. As a result, Paul is bringing into being, through his announcement of the gospel, through his prayer, his pastoral work, and particularly his letters, he's bringing into being a new cultural and social reality, breaking with existing patterns and forms, and yet demonstrating an attractive and compelling new way of being human. It is, as some people have described it, Judaism for the masses. Nietzsche sneered at Christianity and said that Christianity was Platonism for the masses. Well, maybe some 19th century Christianity was, that's what he was mocking. But really, it is this Jewish vision of one God, one people, and it's for everybody. And to that end, what Paul was doing through his preaching, teaching, pastoral work was aiming at renewed human lives. He says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may figure out and put into practice what God's will is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Renewed humans, he says in Colossians 3, renewed in knowledge according to the image of the Creator. Paul has this vision of humans made in God's image, and humans now renewed in God's image, and humans therefore renewed in thought. Paul says, when it comes to evil, just stay as ignorant little babies, but when it comes to thinking, be grown-ups. The gospel for Paul is all about people discovering what it means to be genuine humans, not least by learning how to think. For Paul, you see, somebody asked me this in a radio interview earlier today. Why doesn't Paul refer more to Jesus' teaching? That's an interesting question, but one of the answers, not the only answer, but one of the answers is, if in order to answer a question, what you have to do is to look up something on a shelf, oh yes, that's it, and then put the book back, you don't grow. That may see you around the next corner, But what Paul does instead is not just to teach them what to think, but to teach them how to think. That's why he says in Philippians 2, you've got to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That doesn't mean do good works to impress God. It means you've got to figure out what this means. Here are the tools, now you go to the job. And actually that's so for Scripture as a whole, but it's certainly part of Paul's ministry, that it's never a look it up and put the book back on the shelf kind of thing. It's all about every generation has to engage with this stuff in an increasing maturity of thought and reflection. Because only if we're doing that will we be the kind of communities and the kind of individuals that God wants us to be. And if it's a renewed human community, a renewed thinking human community, it's a renewed thinking and loving human community. A community which is founded on the basis, as Paul says, that the love of the Messiah drives us on. Or as it says in Galatians, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And that love then has to reflect out into the, because that's what does the trick. That's what makes people think, nothing else in my life looks like this. This is where genuine life is to be found. So what was Paul himself like? Towards the end of the book, I wrote a few pages on this, and I just want to quote a few little bits from that. The first thing coming at us through the story is his sheer energy. We feel it pulsing through the letters. We watch as he responds to violence in one city by going straight on to the next one and saying and doing the same things. He's working all hours, his hands hardened with tent making, his back stiff from bending at the workbench, but he's ready every moment for the visitor with a question, for the distraught youngster whose parents have thrown him out, for the local official worried what's going to happen if people discover he's following Jesus, and so on and so on and so on. But the second thing is his blunt, upfront habit of telling it like he sees it. He'll say boo to every goose within earshot and to all the swans as well. There is a reason why Saul of Tarsus is the one getting into trouble, just as there is a reason why the Jerusalem apostles decided to pack him off to Tarsus. He confronts Peter in Antioch and so on. He's the kind of man you want on your side in a debate, even if he may alienate some more sensitive souls. He still does that today. He confronts the magistrates at Philippi. He's itching to speak to the vast crowd at Ephesus. He tries to explain himself to the Jerusalem mob that's been trying to lynch him. He rebukes the high priest. He knows how to turn the factions in the Sanhedrin against one another. He lectures the Roman governor himself about justice, if you please. He tells the ship owner where he should and shouldn't spend the winter, and when it goes horribly wrong, he says, I told you so. He spots the sailors trying to bolt and tells the centurion to stop them doing it. As a companion, he must have been exhilarating when things were going well and exasperating when they weren't. As an opponent, he could cause some people to contemplate murder as their only recourse. It's very interesting. I've done various odd jobs in my time, and people write doctoral dissertations about how successful companies and not-for-profit organizations begin. And in 99 cases out of 100, there's someone like Paul, hammering away, getting things off the ground, confronting local authorities, raising money, persuading co-workers what needs to be done, never losing the vision, taking the bull by the horns. Someone will go on insisting the whole time, we've got to do this stuff. But there's also something disarming about his vulnerable side, which means that despite his relentlessness, people loved him and wanted to work with him and wept when he left. When he says that his heart is open wide, we believe him. It rings true. His honesty shines out. With Paul, what you see is what you get, even if it isn't always what you wanted. You know where you are. You know he will do anything for you because he would say, God has done everything for us in the Messiah Jesus. And so it goes on. That's what he was like. So what? Where does this leave us? I found as I was working on this book, the letters were coming to life in a new way. I've been studying Paul on and off all my life, but they came up in three dimensions again and again as part of a fully rounded history, a warts and all history, a multicultural, swirling, multi-ethnic mix. And for us, now as then, we struggle with the things he struggled with. When I was writing my previous big book on Paul and the Faithfulness of God, I was looking for what are the things that Paul wants to see which tells the world what sort of a community this is. And the two things again and again are unity and holiness. Now, any of you in church work, you know as well as I do, unity is easy if you don't care about holiness. Holiness is easy if you don't care about unity. Trust me, I'm a bishop, I know. The trick, the really difficult thing, is to have them both together. That is really, and that's what Paul is working at. That's why the pastoral side of him is wrestling in 1 Corinthians with what it means, all this stuff about food offered to idols. What does it mean to be holy in a pagan city? To be monotheistic in a pagan city? What does it mean to be united when in the church there are some people who think it's fine to eat any meat that's sold in the market because God made it all and he loves us, so that's okay, and other people are still crushed with the burden of their pagan past and don't want to touch that meat in case it reminds them of the way they used to live. Paul the pastor brings unity and holiness together, confronting a confused and dangerous world with the challenge and the comfort of the unstoppable love of the Creator God. That's why I love him. That's why I want to go on studying. And that's what this book's about. Thank you very much.
Have a seat. I'm sure it wasn't lost on you that the bells rang throughout your talk and ceased the moment I came up, which is an indication of Westminster Abbey's view. This is a remarkable book, Professor Wright. It's historical, anthropological, sociological, theological. But in addition to you being a professor, you're also a pastor. You referred to that just now. You were a bishop. And so I want to start by asking you about one of the things that you draw out in the book in relation to suffering. You write this: the visit to Rome ends with the start of Paul's new life, that of a suffering apostle. God's kingdom is indeed breaking in, that new divine rule, but it will mean undergoing suffering. Again, you write, the bodily marks of identification that mattered to Paul were not the signs of circumcision, but the marks of Jesus, in other words, the signs of suffering. How does the apostle commend the Christian faith in the first century, and how does that compare to things we often hear today in the church, where people are promised health and wealth, a triumphalism, a God at your disposal? How does Paul differ?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I personally don't usually attend churches that promise things like that, and that's just my background.
But you'll know that many people do.
I know that many people do, absolutely. And, I mean, we can't get round sayings of Jesus about I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly. You know, that's absolutely comes with. And when Paul talks about love and joy and peace, that's all true. But when Paul talks about those things, he's either writing from prison or he's writing with the wounds still on him from the last time he was beaten up or stoned or whatever. So there's an odd, rich mixture. I think the crucial thing for Paul is that he really believes that he is living on the cusp of the new creation, that the new creation has broken in, but the old creation not only is rumbling on and it's deadly and it's corrupt and it's decaying, but the old creation resents the new creation breaking in and is doing its best to strike back. And I think that's what Paul thinks was going on in his moment of terrible darkness in Ephesus, which he talks about in 2 Corinthians 1. And by the way, I had a letter just last week from a pastor I knew from a previous job who had been reading that book, and I hadn't heard from him for some years, but he said that passage had reduced him to tears because he had just been through a period like that in his pastoral ministry, and he thought, oh my goodness, Paul went through this too. This is my life. And it was hugely encouraging to him. So that I think the main thing is that Paul is telling people that God's new world is breaking in. It has broken in Jesus. It is breaking in through the power of the Spirit. But if you are on the leading edge of that, and if you're committed to following Jesus and living in one of these extraordinary multivalent fictive kinship groups, i.e. churches, then stuff is going to happen. The powers are going to strike back. And sometimes that's apparently rather trivial, and sometimes it's very dark and very nasty. But it often involves suffering of one sort or another. I was reflecting, I didn't know you were going to ask me that question, but I was reflecting a couple of days ago for quite a different reason. I have a prayer list, people I pray for every day, some I pray for every week, etc. And I went right down a long list, and I realized that all these people, old friends, family members, etc., I know things about their lives where there are points of darkness and suffering and pain and grief and anxiety, one after another after another. You know, what we think of as the sort of normal, happy, healthy family actually is very, very rare. Almost all of us have got sorrows and pains and difficulties and angsts here and there. And for Paul, that is multiplied by the fact of being on the leading edge of the New Age breaking. And he teaches his congregations this is going to happen.
So he teaches them about suffering. But there's another thing that you draw out in the book, and that is Paul's emphasis on what you call the absolute condemnation of sexual immorality.
Yeah.
Now, again, I was reading a lecture by Professor Larry Hurtado at Edinburgh University, and he writes, Christianity effectively erased the double standard. Men were to practice the same kind of sexual discipline that was expected of women. The moral quality of the Christian life for both men and women was to shine in the culture.
Yeah.
And yet again, you seem to be suggesting, here's the Apostle Paul commending Christianity, and what are the two bulwarks? He says you're going to suffer, and there's to be no sexual immorality.
Yeah.
That's hardly a great marketing slogan, is it?
No, and although I think this may be one of the reasons why, as Rodney Stark argues in his book, The Rise of Christianity, why a lot of women found Christianity very attractive, because instead of being abused and exploited, this was a new world in which they were valued and cherished, and in which men behaved themselves, supposedly. Now, of course, the church had failings and then and now. You see it in 1 Corinthians. But it's part of the new creation, the idea, and you see this in Mark 10 in Jesus' teaching, the idea that if God is remaking the world, let's get Genesis 1 and 2 right this time. And that means, you know, the standards of marriage which are there in the Jewish world and which are now an innovation in the pagan world. I mean, I forget who it was, some classical writer, some modern writer about the classics I was reading, who said that basically in the ancient pagan world, for a man, Larry's point, you just had as much sex as you could, and the only thing that was stopping you was kind of jealous husbands or whoever, that otherwise it was open season. And so for the early church to stand out on this is truly remarkable. The great philosopher and doctor at the end of the 2nd century, Galen, doesn't know much about the Christians, but he knows two things about them, on both of which make him think that they're mad. One, they believe in the resurrection of the body, and two, they don't sleep around. Wouldn't it be nice if the church was known for that today? In both cases, this is a valuation of the goodness of creation. It's a celebration of what it means to be made in the image of God, made with bodies that are to be redeemed and therefore are to be valued, instead of being treated as trivial toys.
Third, Paul received revelations from Jesus himself. Paul didn't just decide to be an apostle one day. He was chosen by Jesus Christ, who appeared to him, changing Paul's life forever.
What happened on the road to Damascus?
If we asked Paul that, he would say, Jesus revealed himself to me, and/or I met him, I saw him. For Paul, this wasn't what we would mean by a vision. In other words, Paul is quite clear this isn't like the subjective visions that other people have. He differentiates his seeing of Jesus from any subsequent ones. He says, last of all. So it's a resurrection appearance. It's the risen Lord appearing personally. And in order to make sense of that, I think Paul would say to us in our late modern world, you need to understand that in God's world, heaven and earth are not far apart. They are made to overlap and interlock. That's very counterintuitive for us, because our culture is deeply Epicurean, with a distant God and a heaven, and we're down here. But in biblical thought, heaven and earth are made for each other, and Jesus stands at the intersection. And so how did that happen? I've argued in the book, and this isn't original to me, other people have said this as well, that Paul was praying on the road to, he's a zealous Jew, off to do God's business, so of course you're praying that you will be in a state of holiness while you're doing this terrible work. And one of the ways that devout Jews prayed was to use Ezekiel chapter 1, the whirling wheels of the throne chariot, and then the chariot itself, and then your eyes go up to the figure on the chariot. And I've argued in the book that maybe Paul was doing that, and that when he got to see who was sitting on the divine throne chariot, it was Jesus himself, which is a moment of total fulfillment and total confusion and devastation. It destroys everything and fulfills everything.
Was that, in the language of theologians, the moment he was converted?
I wouldn't put it like that. If I say someone was converted today, the normal assumption would be this person has been an atheist or an agnostic or whatever and has come to faith, had a spiritual experience. Paul was a deeply spiritual man, deeply prayerful man, who worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the creator God, the God of Israel. Paul never stopped worshipping the creator God, the God of Israel, throughout his life. What happened was that he came to realize that this God he'd always worshipped had acted in and as Jesus, and then he quickly came to realize was active in and through his Spirit. So we have to be very careful in case we give the impression that Paul leaves something called Judaism and embraces something called Christianity. The isms and the ities are a 19th century invention. That's part of our problem.
But the reality is that the apostle stops enforcing Jewish obedience to the law, something he'd done with violence.
Yep. But he says,
after that experience.
Yeah, this is where we need to subpoena the whole of Galatians chapter 3, because that's where he hammers that one out, where he makes the very strong argument that God made promises to Abraham about how he was going to save the whole human race, in principle, I mean, save people of all sorts, if you like, and that the law, the Mosaic law, was given as a good but temporary dispensation. And that's a complicated bit of theology, but it's necessary to say the law was good, but its purpose is now fulfilled, and Moses is kind of pointing on. In Romans 8 he says what the law couldn't do, God has now done. That's the key.
Fourth, Paul tested his revelations. Paul was smart enough to know that lots of people think they're getting revelations from God when they really aren't. So after receiving revelations and preaching the gospel, he went to Jerusalem and submitted his gospel to the original apostles of Jesus to make sure it lined up with the gospel of Jesus. Paul's message was confirmed by Jesus' apostles. Fifth, as a Pharisee, Paul was obsessed with preserving and passing on authoritative tradition. Paul describes his life as a Pharisee by saying, "I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions." Paul's obsession with tradition doesn't go away when he becomes a Christian. He just changes the source of authority. As a Pharisee, he would have passed on traditions he obtained from respected rabbis. As a Christian, he passed on traditions he obtained from Jesus' apostles. So the idea that Paul, who had been trained all his life to carefully and zealously preserve and pass on authoritative tradition, the idea that he's somehow reinventing Christianity out of his own head with no respect for what Jesus and his apostles actually taught, goes against everything we know about Paul and his background. Sixth, history supports Paul's view of Jesus wherever we can test his claims. Even if we take a critical approach to the history of Jesus, there are certain facts we can establish. For instance, Jesus viewed himself as bringing about the kingdom of God. Jesus viewed himself as the Messiah. Jesus viewed himself as the Son of God. Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus' followers were convinced that he had appeared to them, risen from the dead. These are the kinds of things we learn about Jesus through historical investigation, and they're exactly the kinds of things Paul says about Jesus. Seventh, Paul endured vicious persecution for his message and never backed down. Muslims like to point out that Muhammad was persecuted in Mecca, and this is true. But the persecution Muhammad endured was like a vacation in Hawaii compared to the lashings and imprisonments and shipwrecks and stoning and beheading that Paul went through. The reason this is important is that the more you're persecuted, the more reason you have to stop and think, was that really a revelation from God that I received? I need to be sure because it's costing me a lot. Paul's patient endurance in the face of torture and death shows that his experiences of the risen Jesus must have been thoroughly convincing.
He knows that he's fulfilling Isaiah 52 verses 13, 14 and 15, that kings shall shut their mouths because of him. You know, that here is the servant preaching the gospel of the servant, and he expects the nations of the world to be shocked, even if it means they kill him en route.
Well, that's a great moment for me to shut my mouth. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor N.T. Wright.
Thank you.